Good evening. I'm Mark Updegrove, the director of the LBJ Library, and on behalf of the Texas Book Festival, I want to welcome you here this evening. There are a couple entities I want to thank. One is the Jack S. Blanton Endowment for helping us with our speaker, Sam Tanenhaus, this evening. We're very grateful to them. And of course, we're grateful to our partners at the Texas Book Festival for joining us on this event. As always, I want to welcome our friends, and for those of you who are not our friends, we'd like you to be our friends. We have some wonderful programming coming up. Next month, we have Carlos Pascual, who's the U.S. Ambassador to Mexico. We have the Harry Middleton Lecture with Sandra Day O'Connor in late November. In February next year, we'll have the Harry Middleton Lecture with Jimmy Carter. We have Woodward and Bernstein coming next year. We have some amazing things coming up, and we very much want you to be a part of it. So please consider that, and there's information that our folks will be glad to give you outside of the auditorium when you leave. A couple of special introductions I'd like to make. I want to welcome, as always, Catherine Robb, the granddaughter of President and Mrs. Johnson. I want to welcome Heidi Marquez Smith, the executive director of the Texas Book Festival, and Clay Smith, the library director of the Texas Book Festival, with a hearty congratulations on an enormously successful festival that occurred last weekend. So welcome to them. I hope you'll indulge me if I welcome my wife, Evie Updegrove. This is her first program here at the LBJ Library, and I'm delighted to have her. Thank you for that. And I want to welcome back Lucy Johnson. You had a lot of thoughts and prayers going your way since last spring, Lucy. It's great to see you back here. It is my pleasure to introduce David Oshinsky, who will in turn introduce Sam Tanenhaus, the editor of the New York Times Book Review. David holds the Jack S. Blanton Chair in History at the University of Texas, where he specializes in American political and cultural history of the 20th century. He is the author of numerous books, including more recent works like A Conspiracy So Immense, The World of Joe McCarthy, Polio, An American Story, for which he won the Pulitzer Prize in 2006, and his most recent work, Capital Punishment on Trial, Furman versus Georgia, and the Death Penalty in Modern America. And no surprise, some fans. And no surprise, he also writes for the New York Times Book Review. Please join me in welcoming David Oshinsky.
Thank you. Tonight we're going to have a conversation with one of really the leading public intellectuals in the United States, Sam Tanenhaus. As Mark mentioned, Sam is the editor of the New York Times Book Review. He also spent some time last year running the New York Times Sunday Weekend Review as well. Sam has written on everything from Andre Agassi to Sarah Palin. I mean, he covers all grounds. He's worked for Vanity Fair, where he was a contributing editor doing wonderful stuff. He writes for the New Republic, the New York Review of Books. I first met Sam probably about almost 20 years ago when he was working on his Whittaker Chambers book. And I reviewed it. I didn't know Sam. I reviewed it for the Washington Post and just thought it was an extraordinarily honest and sophisticated account of a leading conservative intellectual who had been given short shrift by much of the publishing community. Sam, at the moment, in his spare time, is writing a biography of William S. Buckley, Jr., and we will talk about that as well. So let me also now introduce Sam Tanenhaus.
So we're wired here. Everybody can hear us?
Yeah.
I told David his reward for inviting me to visit all of you here is that now that we're being seen in public together, we can't review any more of his books in the New York Times Book Review.
He's kidding. I just wanted to start off with a little story that Harry Middleton knows all too well, although denies. And that is the first time I came to the LBJ Library about 25 years ago. I'd written a book on Joe McCarthy, and they were generous enough to award it the Hardeman Prize. So I came down to Austin with my wife to pick up the award and to come to the banquet. And I came to the LBJ Library for the first time, and Harry was at the door. The session was supposed to start at 6 o'clock. This was about 5 o'clock. And when I walked in the door, Harry said to me, "Good to meet you, and we're really looking forward to your speech tonight." And it was the first time anyone had mentioned the speech. And I was flummoxed. And I remember I looked at my wife and said, "Do you have Valium with you?" And she said, "I do. How much do you need?" And I said, "Just give me the bottle," as I remember. And Harry, rather than taking a tour, Harry took me up to the apartment. I told him I wanted to go over notes I hadn't yet written. And took a couple of Valium, wrote out a speech. I have no memory of giving it. But apparently it turned out very well. And since then, I've really been a great admirer and fan of Harry and Betty Sue and now Mark and the Johnson family and all they do for the Austin community, for historians everywhere. It's quite extraordinary. So thank you. Sam, I guess we're going to break this into several parts. The first is talk a little bit about the Sunday Times book review.
Anybody here read it, by the way? Do you? Can I sorry, David, I have to do a little business. Do you read it in the print edition, or you read it online, or both? Print? Okay, sorry.
No, I was going to ask you that. All right, let me cross that baby off. All right. It is obviously particularly for authors, the most powerful and mysterious of its kind. It's kind of the skull and bones of the publishing industry. And I guess for every writer has the dream of getting his or her book published reviewed in the New York Times Book Review.
Unless we don't like it, then they get. Right.
Well, what I was going to preface this with is, when I used to go, the Times is now in a spanking new building, but they had an old building not far away. And I used to go to the book review, and when you walked in, there was this giant dumpster, and it was just filled with hundreds and often thousands of books that never reached the review stage. And I assume the books, were sent to Strand for the Christmas Fund or something like that. But what that dumpster always reminded me of were the odds of getting reviewed in this publication. So I guess what I'd like to begin with is to have Sam give some sense of the process. In other words, how do you choose books to review?
Well, there are some, by the latest count I read, 200,000 books published a year. Now, books are published in more formats than they used to be, right? You've all been hearing about ebooks. Have any of you read them? But those are electronic books you read on a handheld device. And I can tell you here, sort of a public announcement, David probably doesn't know this, that before too long, we're actually going to incorporate ebook sales onto our bestseller list. We will have a bestseller list of ebooks. It's an entirely new format. Those are books we wouldn't even see, that you couldn't put them in the dumpster, right? They're only electronic. So there are self-published books. There are books called print on demand. There are many reprints of books that were classics or maybe not classics a generation or two ago. All these books crowd our shelves. One of the differences between the new building and the old building is we don't have the big dumpster anymore. We have 3 slightly smaller ones. And the books come in at a rate of several hundred a day. They come in the form, generally, the more traditional books, of what we in publishing, maybe some of you call galleys, or advanced reading copies. They're those paperback versions of a book before it's really a book. That's when we first see it, months before the book is actually published. We have a staff of 7 or 8 editors whose business during the day is to edit the book reviews we put in the review. And their job on the weekends is to plow through a lot of these books. Now, some are automatically eliminated. Some of the books I mentioned to you, we would not review just on principle, not a high moral or aesthetic principle. It gives us a way just to cut down the size. If you've published your book yourself and a publisher hasn't done it, brought it out in a trade edition normally, or what big commercial publishers do, the chances are someone can't get it in a bookstore. If you can't get it in a bookstore, what use is there for us to review it? A reader reads about it and can't get it, and your answer is, well, maybe they can get it on Amazon or somewhere online, which has complicated things for us a little bit. For now, we still abide by maybe outmoded rule. If you can't get a book somewhere in a bookstore, we're probably not going to review it. We don't do a lot of business books, self-help, how-to books. All those compose, if you put them together in aggregate, a pretty high percentage of what's out there. So then you're left with a smaller group of books that are potentially reviewable by us. And our judgments are very subjective. It doesn't mean an editor has decided that book A is better than book B. What he may or she may have decided is, okay, there was a war in Afghanistan. Here's a book that tells us something about it. It may not be that well written. Nonfiction does not have to be as well written as fiction for all of you aspiring authors out there, because nonfiction, the most important thing is the subject. That's what the reviewer does. David is a really superb reviewer for us at the Book Review because he excels at actually telling the reader what's in the book, which many book reviewers don't do. And so that's the principal standard for nonfiction. Does it have information or some kind of content, an argument that we think a reviewer will be able to write about in such a way that it will interest you as a reader whether or not you read the book. The fact is, a lot of people are reading book reviews, we can say it, so you don't have to read the book, right? We're a newspaper, we're giving you the information. So it's very subjective based on the preview editors, as we call them, and there's some books I'll do myself, or the deputy editor, Bob Harris, will take. For instance, he's a big adventure buff. He knows about all the polar expeditions, all the early voyages around the world. So whenever those books come out, he previews them. That's good and that's bad. Here's why it's good. He knows everything about them. Here's why it's bad. He knows everything about them. If you have written a book that's pretty good about a polar expedition, Bob has probably read in the last 10 years 1,000 books like that. So the bar keeps getting raised higher. And if you think our bar is high, wait till you see what the reviewers do with them. One reason I asked if people here read the book review is you probably notice most reviews are kind of mixed. It's a kind of on the one hand, on the other, right? We've sent those books out because we assume the reviewer, whether or not he likes the book, will at least take it seriously. And even those reviews come back often more negative than positive. So what we don't want to do is send books off to reviewers, especially by new authors, that will just be pulverized in our pages because we haven't done anybody any good. We have, if not harmed the career of a young writer, bruised his or her ego pretty badly, raised doubts in the publisher's mind, taken up the reader's time. The reader is going to, after one paragraph, not read the journalism. So we're keeping in mind, not in a very scientific way, but almost in a kind of intuitive way, all these factors when we decide what should get reviewed, which is why we make mistakes often. And we can fit in maybe 15 to 20 reviews a week, depending on how many pages we have each week, which in turn depends on how much advertising we have. The more advertising, the more pages we get. The advertisers pay for the print, in effect. So if we're reviewing about 1,000 books, 1,500 tops in a year, and there are 200,000 being published, It's a very, very tiny percentage.
Tell me something.
And we review more, by the way, far more than anybody
anyone
else.
Right.
Yeah.
Sam, is there a lobbying process? I mean, a publisher's lobbying you, agents lobbying you, even authors lobbying you?
Well, lobbying is kind of a strong word for it. Strong word always means, yeah, you know, the accurate word. Seasonally, usually it's publicists rather than editors or publishers. The publicists are the ones who are in charge of the free publicity, and that's how they see book reviewing. David sees himself performing a high public service when he reviews a book. The publisher of the book he's reviewed sees this as free publicity. Right? So they come in seasonally. They have catalogs. There are really 2 or sometimes 3 major seasons in publishing: fall, winter, and spring. A book that's published in July is a spring book. Don't ask me why. That's how they do it. And they'll come in with their catalog, meet with me very briefly, and tell me what the very most likely titles for us are. Now, the fact is, we look at the books ourselves. There are very few book review sections left in all of American journalism. Our obligation increases as the others go out of business. There's not a book review section in the Washington